Tonight on the show, we are joined by one of Australia's most respected ecologists and global leaders in biodiversity and forest conservation. He is a distinguished Professor of Ecology and Conservation Biology at the Australian National University and is best known for his decades-long large-scale research into how forests work, wildlife survival, and the impacts of logging, land clearing, and bushfires. He has authored over 995 scientific papers and 51 books that have reshaped how we understand and improve nature conservation practices. Beyond academia, he is also a prominent and often outspoken critic of environmental policies that ignore the evidence, particularly when it comes to native forest logging and biodiversity loss. Not afraid to speak the truth to power, he's passionate about making sure decisions about our environment are grounded in science, not politics or short-term profits. Welcome to the Citizen Science Show podcast, Professor David Lindenmayer.
Thank you, Danny. Great to be here.
It's lovely to have you here too. Thank you so much for your time today. I would love to start by you telling us, where did your life begin?
My scientific life really began in my mid-teens. My father was a passionate bird nut. He used to go on these field trips with the Canberra Ornithologist Group, as it was then called. So these were volunteers that would go out into all kinds of environments in the ACT in New South Wales, go on bird trips. And my father was not an easy person. And one of the ways that I tried to get to know him was to go on these bird trips. And it always used to amaze me that it was impossible to see the birds around us, but these people knew what these birds were. And they seemed to be able to hear a bird fart from 400 metres and know what it was. So I kind of got intrigued by that. The connection to the environment has been a pretty important part of my life ever since then. For example, this morning I was on Black Mountain, which is the reserve in the middle of Canberra, and my daughter has started her own project on birds, and we've spent 2 weeks together scoping out sites to do for her pilot studies for her postgraduate thesis work. That's just a great thing to be able to do with friends and family, and it's like learning another language. So people learn how to speak German or French or Mandarin or whatever. I didn't learn a language. I learned how to speak bird and learn what birds are in the environment as an outcome of all the calling that they do.
Yeah. So when did your vision go from looking at the birds in your immediate vicinity to that landscape scale of vision, or what you'd call probably the bird's eye view?
Possibly even before that. My parents used to take us on these epic car journeys from Melbourne to central Queensland, where my grandparents were. And those were the days in cars where there was not really a functional radio, certainly no laptops or Walkmans or CD players or
seatbelts.
Or seatbelts. Yeah, that's another story. And so all you could do really was to look out the window. I often used to think about the landscapes and how they were put together. There's strings of trees along river systems, but cleared elsewhere, and residual patches of bush on hills and things like that.
Wow.
Kind of an interesting process of learning to be entertained by the environment, to be entertained by the landscape and think about how landscapes fit together.
Wow, you had time to dream.
Yeah, I think that's really important, to have time to think as well. Now, that's one of the great things about doing field work, and I do a lot of field work still, is that you do have time to think. I have my little red notebooks, waterproof notebooks, or my little yellow notebooks, and being out in the environment is not only really good for my mental health and my physical health, but it also stimulates lots of ideas about how does the environment work? Why does it work in the way it does? How might it change if it's disturbed either by humans or naturally? And what might the response of biodiversity be? And I still have those sources of inspiration whenever I spend time in the bush. Even this morning, walking past a native cherry, Exocarpus, beautiful tree, dense vegetation, different green to the others of the eucalypts in the reserve. And just to stop for a brief second, something catches your eye, and there's a mother and father booble cow with 3 fledglings. And you don't see that sort of thing very often, but when you take time to be in the bush, you do experience those things, and you always see something different. Every time you're out, there's something new that you didn't see before, which I think is really quite an inspiration.
Continual inspiration by the sounds of it. How much of your children influenced this and continue to, I guess, inspire you?
My kids are very much into the environment. My daughter's studying conservation biology. My son studied environmental science. He's fantastic in the field. He does epic trips in the field that I could never even contemplate these days. He's walked in Kyrgyzstan, in Patagonia, in Tasmania, New South Wales, all over Australia. He's special in the field that way. He just loves it. That's his happy place. My daughter's different. She loves also being in the field. Her happy place is the science. It takes all types, but the natural landscapes and the natural environment, I think, are a huge source of inspiration for many people.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems is that many Australians are actually quite disconnected from their natural environment. And I think that's not good for their physical health, but it's also not good for their mental health. And I know that many of my colleagues and friends and family members feel a lot better after they've spent some time walking in the bush and just seeing nature doing its thing.
Absolutely. When you started your researching career, what was one of the first questions you asked?
First part of my research career proper was working for an extraordinary scientist, Professor Andrew Smith, who was then at the University of New England. His job was to do a contract on where did Leadbeater's possum, the faunal emblem of Victoria, where did it occur and why did it occur where it did? So I was his technical officer. He was based in Armidale in New South Wales, and I was in the tall wet forests of Victoria. And really, there was a lot of time spent in the forest coming to terms with the idea that the landscape can be covered in trees, it can be all forest, but not all parts of forest are created equal for particular species. There are places where animals are likely to occur and places where they're not. Trying to understand what it is about particular places that make them good habitats or not so good habitats is a really important part of ecology. That was my first job, working for a brilliant scientist who really started to get me thinking about this whole idea of distribution and abundance. Where do things occur? Why do they occur where they do? What happens when a landscape is disturbed or altered? What's going to be their response? And how can we best manage these environments so that these species can survive, reproduce, do their things, maintain viable populations, continue to evolve, all that kind of stuff.
So in your decades of research now, does the Leadbeater's possum still feature prominently in your work?
It certainly does. So I first began to work for Andrew Smith in July 1983 in the tall wet forest outside of Melbourne. And we still work in those forests 43 years later.
Wow. This is one of these examples of your long-term studies. 43 years. Okay.
That's correct. And my wife's family lives in the Yarra Valley outside of Melbourne, which is right on the doorstep of those tall wet forests. I go down to those forests many times every year. People from all over the world want to see them. Other scientists, politicians, environmentalists, all kinds of people. And so I have a person that works full-time in the field. Her name is Nina Page. She's a brilliant young scientist and is doing a fantastic job to continue that long-term work, measuring the trees, measuring the carbon, helping to count the birds, counting possums and gliders, all kinds of things. So there's a whole array of exciting projects that we do in that forest still. Some of them have been running the whole time, the big trees and how they're changing. Some of them are new projects, like our new work on mechanical thinning of forests and its impacts on biodiversity. So it's a mixture of very old, long-term running projects and new ones that have just begun.
It's incredible. You must have seen some, well, probably some heartbreaking, but hopefully some promising results over this time. Can you elaborate on any of your results?
Oh, yes, there are many exciting discoveries over these times. So, for example, we discovered that, yes, indeed, there were parts of the forest where Leadbeater's possum was likely to occur. But very quickly, we discovered that it wasn't just Leadbeater's possum that we needed to know about. There were greater gliders, yellow-bellied gliders, common ringtail possums, mountain brush-tail possums, feather-tail gliders. There's a whole panoply of wonderful beasties that come out at night in those forests. And so we were able to work out the differences in the habitat of these different species, but also differences in the big trees that they need. A greater glider tree is different from a Leadbeater's possum tree, and a sugar glider tree is different from a mountain brush-tail possum tree. So these animals are partitioning up the nest tree, the big hollow tree resource, in quite interesting ways. But not only are they partitioning that resource, each individual animal will often move from one tree to another, from day to day to day. So that each day they end up in a tree where they spend the day before they come out at night. So these animals swap regularly between these different trees. And I suppose it becomes one of the reasons why old forest with lots of these really big trees with different kinds of hollows becomes so important for so many of these species.
Wow.
And it's really an interesting understanding of that kind of ecology of how the forest is changing and the different resources that a forest produces and maintains. That sort of lies at the heart of not only mammal biodiversity, the different possums and gliders, but we see very similar things amongst the array of bird species that also occur in the same forest.
Why are so many of these animals you've just mentioned, the gliders and the possums, why are they now endangered? In fact, critically endangered?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about Australia is the number of species that depend on really big trees, particularly hollows in trees. But it's not just the hollows. Big living trees produce way more flowers, more seeds, more pollen, more nectar. And so these really big trees in the landscape are crucial parts of habitat for these different animals. But what we see is that big trees populations are declining very, very quickly. So in those tall wet forests outside of Melbourne, we've seen a halving of the number of big trees since we first started measuring carefully populations of them in 1983. And that has a huge effect. We're able to see a strong link between the declines of those big trees and the declines of not only mammals, but also birds. And so we've been able to document that. But the problem of big tree loss is driven by several things. One is climate change. Big trees are very vulnerable to a drying and warming climate because they have to pump water from the root system in the soil, sometimes close to 100 metres up into the top of the canopy. And under really hot, dry conditions, that really disrupts that water conducting role. And so we see increased rates of mortality of those big trees, but we're also seeing changes in fire. So we're seeing a lot more fire that's a lot more severe and intense, a lot less patchy than it used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago. We're also seeing the results of extensive logging, where logging takes away not only the big trees, but also disrupts the recruitment of new, younger trees that would eventually become older trees. And more recently, we've also discovered that a forest that is logged becomes more flammable, and more flammable forests burn at high severity and burn more frequently. And that also prevents the recruitment of new cohorts of these big trees. So what's really happening is that these forests are being simplified from being largely old growth with small patches of regrowth embedded within it to now being very flammable, young regrowth forests that simply don't have the large old tree resource that's crucial for many animals, including the different species of possums and gliders. When I first started working in the 1980s, early 1980s, the most common species we would see would be the southern greater glider. And it was just about everywhere. And it's a beautiful animal. It's kind of like a small gliding koala. It's really quite easy to see because it has such bright white eye shine. So standard spotlighting, you can see these animals quite straightforwardly. That species is now endangered when it used to be of least concern conservation-wise and the most readily seen animal from all the spotlight surveys. So this is a consequence of climate change, fire, logging, and the loss of big old trees. And so I think we can really, that's in my lifetime, in the 40 odd years that I've been working as a career scientist. And so those are the kinds of things that we can see changing. We know that we can solve these problems, particularly the way we need to change forest management, and also in more recent times, we need to rethink what we're doing with fire. But that's another story.
Oh, you have your hand in so many pies, but you are recognised globally as the expert in this area. So I don't doubt your recommendations come from a depth of knowledge and experience and factual science. We often hear the term nature is resilient. Is that just a myth?
I think it is partially a myth and it's partially reality. I think nature is resilient if you allow it to be. What's happening now, our example of the greater glider is a somber and sobering perspective on this, is that the greater glider has survived for 20, 30 million years, but it's had to deal with fire. But fire was, in many ecosystems, particularly where the greater glider lives, probably relatively infrequent and likely to be relatively low severity and intensity. And so that means that the greater glider was able to survive because fires weren't as frequent or as severe or as uniform or across the landscape. And changes in climate occurred, but they occurred relatively slowly. Now we're seeing rapid changes in climate, rapid changes in the sequence of fires, or what we call the fire regime. And then we've got other human insults overlaid on top of that, land clearing, logging, and these things interact. So that the problem about resilience to these disturbances is that there are so many of these disturbances occurring, and those disturbances are interacting. Climate change leads to more fires. Climate change leads to the loss of very large old trees. Logging leads to the loss of big old trees. Logging leads to more severe fires. So you can see the interactions between these various stressors that are in the landscape. And that leads to what's called a very high level of total disturbance burden. And so many of these species are resilient to 1 or 2 stresses, but not 3 or 4 or 5, and the interactions between them. So I think we need to be careful about thinking that nature is resilient. Yes, it's resilient, but not when you've got so many different stresses that are occurring so quickly that it makes it very, very difficult for these species to be able to do their thing and keep surviving.
So you study the Victorian fire forests there. The findings you're getting from these forests, are you able to apply them across Australia? Is it the same stresses that we're talking about in Victoria to Queensland to Western Australia?
In many cases, there are similarities. We work not only in the forests of Victoria, but we have projects now in Western Australia, Tasmania, New South Wales, Jervis Bay Territory, south of Sydney. We work in forests and in woodlands. We work in coastal heathlands. And we see some similar things happening in some places, like the loss of big old trees and the declines of possums and gliders. But then we see different things happening in other areas, such as the inland woodlands, where replantings, restoration around farm dams is actually having very positive outcomes. The key thing here is that there are long-term data sets that really help us understand what are the threats, but also what we can do about them to look at species recovery. So it's a mixture, as always in the environment, of very good things happening, but also some not so good things happening, and also being able to determine what's likely to be an effective restoration program or a conservation program relative to something that doesn't seem to work so well.
How do you maintain long-term studies? How do you make them sustainable into the future?
Oh gosh, that's a huge conundrum for me. I've routinely worked somewhere between 70 and 100 hours a week for the last 30 years.
Are you still married? Sorry.
I'm still married, yes. I've still got kids. I just don't sleep a lot. My job isn't really a job in a way. It's actually a way of life. And my family kind of understand that. And I do make a lot of time for other things, just not a lot of sleep. Long-term studies take about 30 hours a week to write grants, to talk to funders and donors, to write the proposals. I'm only successful in about 1 out of every 10 to 15 things that I apply for. So that's the rough and tumble of it. And it's taken a lot to keep things running for quite some time. I think some of these studies and the long-term studies done by other scientists are a really important part of Australia's environmental infrastructure. So we hear politicians talking about roads and railway lines and power lines and those things as part of nation building and infrastructure for the country. But these long-term sites are part of the nation's environmental infrastructure for us to be able to see what's happening with our environments, what's happening with our biodiversity, where do things work, how do we do plantings in the right way to give us the best biodiversity dividends, how do we do feral animal control in the best ways to give us good outcomes and be effective. And we really need long-term data to be able to tell us that, because in a hyper-variable country like Australia, things vary from year to year. Some years are drought years, some years are very wet years, and biodiversity bounces up and down in response to that. But we need to see whether there are long-term changes over and above those year-to-year variations. And long-term data are really the only way to understand what's happening.
What are some of the hard truths about conservation that people don't like to hear?
Gosh, some of the hard truths are that humans have massive impacts. We are the global uber predator. I think many people don't see us in that way. They see humans as somehow set apart from other animals on the planet, and they don't necessarily see the massive impacts that we have on changing the oceans full of plastic, changing the atmosphere full of carbon, changing the way burning is consuming so much of the planet's vegetation. That is really hard for many people to come to terms with, that we really are an uber predator, either directly or indirectly. And some of the numbers are pretty sobering for people to come to terms with. This idea, for example, that humans are about 34 to 36% of the world's mammal biomass. 60% is our livestock, cattle and sheep and goats. Only 4% of the world's mammal biomass are native animals. These are pretty sobering kinds of numbers. So that's one of the big challenges in this space, is for people to understand the impact that they have and then be challenged enough to want to do something about it and want to conserve large protected areas and then dedicate the funding to ensure that they're properly managed. Because you can't just declare a national park and then not manage it. Australia's got too many problems with feral animals, with weeds, inappropriate fire regimes where the fire is either too frequent and too damaging or too infrequent in some places and not providing habitats for particular species that need those early successional environments. So we're going to have to dedicate a significant amount of funding over a prolonged period of time to repair what's happened to this incredible continent that we live on.
Yes, they are sobering words, but you're just speaking the truth, and we need to wake up. Yeah.
At the same time, I think what we often don't do is talk about successes. And we need to give people hope that there are things that can turn around if we do the right thing. And we've got good science to support good management.
Okay. This is your opportunity, David. Hit us with some hope. Tell us about a success.
Oh, I think there's some really good outcomes. So, for example, places like Macquarie Island, a subantarctic island off Tasmania. It's an extraordinary place for seabirds and marine mammals as a breeding area. It used to have cats, rabbits, rats. Those animals had an enormous impact on the vegetation and on the successful breeding patterns of the seabirds and others. And so since there's been an effective eradication program for those feral animals, the vegetation has rebounded, the populations of seabirds and marine mammals have rebounded remarkably. There are other cases where these things have happened around Australia that tell us that when we do things right, we get some really good outcomes. I'll give you another good example. Australia has 1.765 million farm dams on rural properties all over the country. Yeah. About 97% of them are really poorly managed. And when they're poorly managed, they're essentially just cesspools of poor quality water that have almost no biodiversity in them. And that poor quality water emits large amounts of nitrous oxide and large amounts of methane. The emissions from a small number of farm dams, or a single farm dam, in fact, the emissions from a poorly managed farm dam are the equivalent of a small car fleet. And so the amount of emissions from Australia's poorly managed farm dams is equivalent to our landfill sector. But what we've been able to show is it's pretty straightforward to renovate and restore a farm dam. You can do plantings around it. You can plant tussocks around the ground layer. You can fence the area to keep the livestock out. You can pump the water into troughs. And the water quality changes remarkably quickly. And when that water quality changes, a farm dam shifts from being a carbon source to a carbon sink, quite a very strong one. And that can happen within 1 to 2 years of restoration. But the other thing happens is that when the water quality improves, livestock weight gain improves. So you get a better outcome for your farmers because drinking good quality water is good for livestock. But good quality water is also fantastic for a whole range of frog species, of bird species, and things turn up that up until a year or so ago I didn't even know existed, like freshwater sponges in inland rural Australia. Who would have thought? And so this is an example where restoration can shift these farm dams back towards being a sort of a crude proxy for native wetlands. And then we can see this massive boost in bird biodiversity, in frog biodiversity, in all kinds of invertebrates and all kinds of aquatic plants. And it's positive for the environment in terms of fixing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere rather than releasing large amounts of greenhouse gas and giving farmers a production outcome as well. And so these kinds of things are really exciting to see. And we have really good science now to be able to compare literally hundreds of dams that have been restored versus ones that haven't been and see the outcomes.
So there needs to be that investment as well. Like these things don't just happen.
But investment that's guided by good science to give us the best biodiversity outcome, the best carbon outcome, and the best farmer production outcome. Those kinds of win-win-win outcomes are not common, but they do exist, and we need more of those to give people confidence that when we do good investments in the environment, we can get a good outcome from them.
Yeah. What role does Indigenous science play in your research?
Well, I think the term Indigenous science is a misnomer because science in its pure form has a colonial background, undoubtedly, but it's based on creating hypotheses to test in a formal way. And you need formal experimentation to do that. And that, from what my First Nations mentors tells me, is not what Aboriginal people did. They were clearly extraordinary observers of natural environments. So I think of it more as Indigenous knowledge. And what I think is important is that interrelationship and marriage of Indigenous knowledge and Western science. They are actually very different ways of thinking, and there is a really strong potential for cross-fertilization around ideas and management. So, for example, we have a cultural burning study at the moment looking at cultural burning of temperate woodlands in inland Australia, particularly around what we call travelling stock reserves. So 150 years ago, if you were moving your livestock from your farm to the market, you drove them on horseback assisted, through these travelling stock reserves, which was government land, to market. Now that's been superseded by motorised transport, and those travelling stock reserves are still there, and they're very important for conservation. But many of them actually follow ancient songlines from Aboriginal people. So what we've started to do is to work with 3 different nations, the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and the Wiradjuri peoples, and the elders are doing cultural burns in these areas. And at ANU, we're actually looking at monitoring before and after the burn and looking at the biodiversity response, the soil response, and those kinds of things in relation to the burn. And we discovered some really important things. One is that when you burn woodlands in good condition that haven't had a really prolonged intensive grazing pattern overlaid on them, but good quality woodlands in good condition, we get a lot of often quite rare plants that come up after the fire. But if you burn areas in poor condition that have had a really intense grazing history, all we get is weeds. And so you create an additional problem. And so this is where that intersection of Western science and Indigenous knowledge becomes really important. And I think one of the crucial things here is that the elders that are co-investigators on this project, because it's Indigenous-led, their burns are small burns over very small areas. They're very low intensity. They're burns of only a few hectares. And they're cultural burns. They're not the same thing as hazard reduction burns over these vast areas that we're seeing now. And so I think people need to understand that these are very different kinds of fire regimes. A cultural burn was done for one of 3 or 4 different purposes. One was a women's burn to burn small areas for food plants. Then there were men's burns, again, over small areas to create green pick or grass, to bring in herbivores that they could hunt. These were not large burns over huge areas. These were small burns because you wanted to bring the animals to you, and that's the most efficient way to do it. And the third kind of burn was a pathway burn, where if you wanted to move from one part of your nation to another, you would do these very narrow but often very long burns for good reason, and that was that you didn't want to stand on some of these things that might kill you if it bit you, obviously snakes. And so the burns were actually much smaller, much more localised, and for very specific purposes than I think many people recognise. I think there's some really interesting perspectives that come from a respectful intersection and marriage of Indigenous knowledge and Western science. As a Western scientist, I'm acutely aware that we do not want to be stealing the IP of Indigenous people around burning and other aspects of management of country. And it's really important to understand also that many Indigenous people talk about this idea of no fire country. So a key part of cultural burning is actually extensive areas that weren't burned at all.
That's new to Western science.
I think it is too. And at the moment, there's this idea amongst some fire managers is that the entire landscape was burnt regularly all the time. And frankly, that's just nonsensical when you start to talk to First Nations people about. They understand that there were extensive areas that was no fire. Often it was called peace country, where you didn't do production things. That country was there for particular reasons, totem animals, for all kinds of other spiritual reasons. And fire wasn't used in it or used only very rarely. And that's really been an incredible insight to me, including the insight that Indigenous people shared food with, for example, travellers that were coming down travel routes, but they didn't trade food.
It was given, yeah.
I was stunned by that. They traded shells, they traded ochre, spear tips, axes, that kind of thing, but they didn't trade food. And that means that your burns to create green pick or your burns to create food plants or to nurture food plants were often very small, very localized, and there weren't many of them.
And they were shared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Food itself was not traded.
Wow.
And so that means that the scale of that kind of enterprise is very localized. And so you can understand then why living with such a comparatively light touch, you've got people that lived here for 65,000 years. We watch TV, you watch Alone, and if somebody lasts out there for 2 weeks, it's miraculous. 2 weeks. Talking about people that were stewards of the land for 65,000 years. But they were not burning these massively intense burns over these huge industrial scales, which is what's happening with hazard reduction burning now. And I think we've got to understand that cultural burning and hazard reduction burning are hugely different things that have massively different effects on our environments.
How do we incorporate the Indigenous knowledge and Western science into our conservation practices and policies?
Oh, I think we have to be very careful about how we do this. I think we need to recognise that there's a strong cultural sense of how Indigenous people work. I think we have to make sure that we provide the right kinds of opportunities to be able to foster that integration in a respectful way. We've done those kinds of things for a couple of decades now, and it is a really long learning process. I think we have to be aware that there are cases where Western industrial organisations want to take advantage of First Nations people, as they've done through colonial history. And we see that not only in mining, but also in forestry. So, for example, when Vic Forests was shut down in Victoria, that's the government logging company, what happened was that many of the executives of that organisation re-emerged in a new form in a foundation called the Healthy Forest Foundation, where what was going to happen was that the Healthy Forest Foundation was going to help Aboriginal people to log their country. So many of the First Nations mentors that I work with just see that as another form of beads and trinkets, another kind of colonialism. I'm really concerned about First Nations people being taken advantage of yet again by corporate worlds, but in a very cynical form that's exploiting them and dividing them and those kinds of things. And most of my First Nations mentors and elders are appalled by this idea that there are people in various Aboriginal corporations that want to see land logged. Some of the First Nations women that I work with are shocked when they see log country, and they actually do a sorry dance because the forest is like their mother, and having the forest cut down is like having their mother killed. It's some of the most emotional ceremony I've ever seen in my life. And so for some of these corporations, forestry corporations, to take advantage of First Nations people in that way, I think is incredibly cynical. It's got really nothing to do with looking after country. It's actually just finding a different way to keep logging.
Yeah.
So I think we've got to be very careful about some of these things, work together in a respectful way that isn't about finding new methods to screw over country like we've done in the colonial past.
What can citizen scientists do to help?
Well, I've worked with citizen science since early in the 1980s. So the way that we do possums and glider surveys is to bring volunteers out into the forest and train them so that they sit under trees at dusk and count possums as they jump out of these giant trees. We've had over 18,000 volunteers help us in the last 4 and a bit decades. And we wouldn't have had the data sets that we have without the support of the wonderful people that come out and sit in the forest. And then I've worked very closely with many bird watchers, the same kinds of people that I described early in our discussion right now, who could hear a bird fart from 400 metres and know what it was.
They also have long-term studies, yes.
So they've been involved in all kinds of things on biodiversity in plantations, biodiversity in replantings on farms, biodiversity in reserves such as at Buddery National Park. And they help us count birds on many of our long-term sites. And that provides us some of the most fantastic data sets to really see how things are changing across these environments. We wouldn't have been able to do a tiny fraction of the work that we do without the support of dedicated volunteers that they love to come out with us. Often we'll be out in the field for a week, see all sorts of remarkable birds, share knowledge, collect really high quality data that really tells us important new things about how the environment's changing.
Are you hopeful or worried about Australia's forests?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that there will be change. We're seeing states like Western Australia and Victoria starting to move away from native forest logging because it loses so much money. It employs very few people. It makes forests more flammable, and it has massive impacts on carbon emissions, but also on biodiversity. And really what we do know is that our plantation sector is far more profitable, employs far more people, and is a lot less fire prone than our logged and regenerated native forests. I'm hopeful that people will see through some of the bullshit that comes from some of the state government agencies that say that they're no longer logging when they still are. I'm hopeful that we'll see more reserves and that those reserves will be better managed because they'll be properly resourced to be better managed. And I'm hopeful that more and more Australians might understand the extraordinary nature of this country and want to spend more time in it and recognise that there's a huge opportunity for the nation through nature-based tourism, nature-based recreation, and that it's good for the economy, it's good for people's mental health, it's good for people's physical health, and it's good for the health of the continent itself.
Do you think innovative technology, AI, can it get us out of the mess we're in now with so many species in decline?
I think new technology is important, using drones to detect things, to do weed control, pest animal control. There's a role for new technology. I think it's best if it's integrated with people working on the ground. You see things, you experience things, you generate new discoveries by being in the environment. It's not one or the other. It has to be both. It's also important to understand that when we use new technology to detect animals, that changes the data in a fundamentally important ways. I can hear certain things with my own ears that are not detected with automatic bird call recorders, and vice versa. But when you change technology, you change the time series data sets. And so we need to be very careful that we don't throw away what we've learnt from these long-term data sets by embracing new technology without calibrating one with the other. So I think there's a role for new technology, definitely, but there's also a role for ensuring that long-term work continues and that the quality of the data sets, the integrity of the data sets is maintained. Otherwise, we end up potentially throwing away what we've done in the last 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and that would be a disaster.
Yeah. Looking ahead 20, 50 years' time, what do you want to see in the Australian, landscape, political and environmental?
In the next 50 years, I want to see large parts of Australia restored and regenerated. Doesn't mean driving people off the land. It means putting a lot of the tree cover back, but putting it back in a strategic way which allows an integration of agricultural production and biodiversity conservation. I want to see Australia out of native forest logging altogether, but I want to see the plantation sector properly managed. A lot of plantations have issues with weeds and feral animals, and they're often very poor neighbours. So I think the plantation sector needs major reform. I want to see more people in the environment, experiencing the environment, appreciating what an amazing place it is. And I want to see governments invest properly in the environment. A government's priorities are reflected by how much they spend on things. And now Australia spends about 3 cents in every $100 on the environment. That's totally inappropriate. So I think we need to have a rethink about our spending priorities. And the environment needs significant long-term investment. And it probably needs an environment fund that continues to exist beyond short-term political cycles. Similar to our superannuation schemes, we need an environmental superannuation scheme. And we probably need an environment levy, similar to our Medicare levy, to provide sufficient funds to be able to do the things that we have to do around nature repair and restoration. So I think there's some big challenges here, and they're going to require strong political leadership, but we only get the political leaders that we deserve, which means that we have to demand those things as voters. And Australia has the potential to do that. but we have to engage in our political process to make sure that we get the changes that this country really needs.
Thank you so much, David. Do you have any last words or advice for our listeners out there?
I think it's important for people to go out and experience the environment regularly. Get your dose of nature. It's a nature restoration order for your mental health and your physical health. And join some of the volunteer groups. Join up with groups that are replanting, bird groups, others that are friends of Reserve X, National Park Y, special places. Be part of communities that really care about the environment and spread the word about how important the nation's environments really are. Because most people really do think that these are important places. The vast majority of Australians want more national parks. The vast majority of Australians want them properly resourced. That's only going to happen if people lobby their politicians to make sure that those kinds of outcomes occur.
Thank you again. Really appreciate your wisdom, your insights. I hope you begin to sleep better as the future unfolds in the direction that you would like to see it go. Enjoy the journey of your children as they, follow their own pathways. And I'm sure you're going to be that guiding force for many years to come. So we love your work. We really respect you. And we hope you keep doing what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny. Great to chat.